We'll talk about what the Prime Minister in his opening remarks at the opening session of G20 said. But let me bring in Atul Aneja here. Atul, will it be now called G21?
It should be, because it should be.
Okay. Munmun, we want to take on further on what all the Prime Minister touched upon. Very important points, beginning with the human-centric approach, which is the approach that of the Indian presidency of G20.
Yes, but I would want to further build on what has just been announced. How historic is this announcement, Mr. Aneja, to your mind?
Absolutely historic moment, Munmun. African Union becoming 56 countries it represents. So it's not just it's an organization which has come in. And this is where we concretize the Global South agenda. That this is the Global South which has made a bold entry into the G21, and where India has taken the lead in it. And that is something which is going to go down in posterity. It's a big moment, not only for Africa, but for the new world which is emerging, which is no longer a world dominated by a few countries. It's a world where everyone is a stakeholder, and that's the central message. Even Prime Minister, when he made these remarks, that this is not an era where we are going to have silos being created. The entire world is one. Solutions to global problems has to come together. We have to come together to solve that. I think this is a big blow to narrow-minded geopolitics in a way. This is Prime Minister calling of inclusivity and coming together of the world, rather than battling out in the globe on your narrow geopolitical interests.
All right. Do we have Professor Swaran Singh still with us? All right. Okay. Yes, I can see him on the. Professor Swaran Singh, staying on the inclusion of the African Union into the grouping. How significant is this? Atul Aneja with us in the studio says it's significant because it solidifies or formalizes what is referred to as strengthening of the voice of the global South, where most of the world's population lives. They may not be as economically powerful as the rich club, but their populations are directly affected by some decisions which may not be of their own making, and therefore they need to be an important part of the global governance architecture or the decision making. How significant is this? Would this inclusion prove in that step?
Amritpal, as you just heard Munmun say, the Prime Minister started opening of the G20 meeting in New Delhi with a big bang, literally with a big bang, announcing that African Union sits on the table. You look at all international organizations, it takes long period of time to set criterion, standards, protocols, how new members will be taken in. Even recent BRICS, they said we need still 5 months, even when they have agreed and invited 6 new members. And here in G20, you have African Union, as Atul said, 56 countries represented in that, exactly sitting among the G20 from the very beginning. And why is Africa important? Not just 56 countries. Africa is the future center of demographic and democratic and development growth. 18 years of median age. Africa today has 18 years of median age compared to India 28 and China 38 years of median age. And that shows where the young population is coming. And that is why countries are getting increasingly engaged in investing and building trade with Africa. India, of course, has also again, national liberation movement connections, historical, cultural connections with Africa. So being able to, in the very few first minutes of the opening of G20 summit in New Delhi, have African Union sit among the G20 is starting with a big bang in that sense. I mean, it's going to really change the mood of follow-up discussions, which are apparently going to be far more action-oriented in that sense. And this is the first surprise in that sense. Nobody thought that in this very meeting, in the very first few minutes, African Union will be given a seat on the big table and they will be actually participating in this meeting from the very first minute. And that, in that sense, reinforces the whole sense of making G20 far more cohesive. Just remember, it took G7 almost 12 to 15 years to first get in Russia, to make it G8, then get some of these BRICS nations as observers. And finally, in 2009, 2008, and then 2009, of course, emerge as G20. It took long period of time for G7 to expand into G20. But here, in matter of few minutes, in the very opening, you see African Union joining the big table. In that sense, I think that is the first major indication of how India is going to conduct the parleys, the discussions over the coming 3 sessions. And I think this is a great beginning to have African Union sitting on the table right from beginning.
Okay.
Yes.
So one of the stated objectives or the priorities of India, and as which Prime Minister also referred to in his opening remarks at the opening session, where he said bridging the various divides that exist, bridging the north-south divide. Is this an important or significant step in that direction?
Absolutely. This is a new vision altogether. The post-COVID world is getting redefined now, and new rules are emerging. And I think this is the basic rule that it is time to get rid of geopolitics and geopolitical blocks. Time is to unite, and time is to unite everyone, and that includes the global south, which has the maximum population in the world. So this is how you have the one world coming slogan coming into actual implementation stage. Now the concept is laid, the framework is laid. Now is the next part. We have the African countries. Africa also important for one more reason, Amritpal, which is it is home to critical minerals. You see, if you want to have a new economy riding on electric cars and the electric revolution, EVs, etc., you're going to have critical minerals coming, and it's going to come from Africa in large measure. And but the goal here is very interesting because Africa was always mineral rich. The colonial powers went into Africa for its resources,
for the minerals, yes.
for its minerals. But now you have to have a new deal, and you can't be extractive. So you have to be participatory and work in the spirit of partnership, which means resources coming here, but manufacturing also going into Africa. So this is going to be the actual challenges of how we leverage the new world into a win-win kind of a situation. And that's where investments have to come in. And that's where you will have to have multilateral banking changing focus and reorienting themselves into big-time financing. And on top of that, we have global challenges like climate change, etc., which requires huge amounts of capital as well. So these are going to be the concrete roadmaps you need to define now while you are discussing in the G20. You can't decide on everything, but at least you can set the direction for it here. And that itself would be historic. We have had one historic moment here of African Union coming in and becoming member. There has to be several others coming through this because challenges are huge, but the opportunity is also great. And we have the frameworks ready.
Yes. Professor Swaran Singh, I'll come to you now. I've heard the External Affairs Minister of India say that India is not an extractive economy. Now, before Africa, there is this huge challenge of being debt-ridden. There is a huge pile of debt on them, and they would want loans to be given to them, assistance to be given to them, but at a lower interest rate. Assistance that is given to them which is affordable and for the medium term and long term, not for the short term. Now, when African Union sits on the G20 table as the 21st member of G20, do you think that it will have a very, very decisive say on debt restructuring, on issues of not being held hostage by a certain country which is eyeing their minerals?
Munmun, first of all, let me say Africa has always been for last 100 years on the margins of international global decision making. This is a great opportunity now for African Union to sit on the big table. So they will be able to voice their own concerns, participate in decision making. That's a first change. Second, if you look at India's approach to building developmental partnerships with other nations, right from 1950s, the ITEC, International Technical and Economic Cooperation Program of India, which was again geared primarily for Africa, was meant to, what we today's language calls skill building, capacity building, India was always looking at enabling people to find their own dreams, find their own paths of development, rather than building mega projects and making them indebted. Now, partly why the debt crisis have built up over a period of time, of course, more recent reasons of pandemic and Ukraine crisis are only now coming in, but also projects
No.
that have been built but not commercially viable. So therefore, countries are not able to pay back their debt over a period of time. And now when we are talking of rescheduling, if not waiving off of some of these debts, countries like China are finding it very uncomfortable. They are the ones who are not willing to really, fall in line and allow that kind of deferment of debt repayments or waiving off some of these debt payments. And now, so it won't be anymore India speaking for them. African Union is sitting by itself there, representing 56 countries to speak for themselves and negotiate how they want these things to be dealt with, because keeping Africa out is not going to allow the world, howsoever powerful G7 nations could be, to resolve international crisis. Whether climate change or energy crisis or it is food crisis, all kinds of challenges, will have to involve Africa into it. We'll have to make it more inclusive. And when you need Africa on equal footing, Africa is sitting now to speak for themselves as to how some of these challenges can be resolved only if you bring them on board as equal partners. As Atul said, now a lot of manufacturing will have to shift to Africa as well, not just extracting. So extracting of resources was very typically connected to colonial powers and more recently to China's engagements in Africa or in some of the other developing countries. I think that has to change, because that is not going to save us from the crises that are building around one after another. And therefore, at the level of reformation of development banks, for example, that is another major issue where we need to make them more widespread in terms of participation and voting rights, and the agenda that they look at. Even issues of poverty have to be expanded. So reformation in existing, let me openly say, Bretton Woods institution. For example, in one sense, China, which is now 16% of global GDP, has only 5% voting rights in IMF. So a lot of these things will have to, over a period of time, change. And countries that were seen to be on the margins, and Africa is very clearly the most stark case in this, countries that were seen on the margins will have to be now to come to the center stage. And that is why what India is doing. India is trying to make sure that decision making in G20, just like it expanded from G7 to G20, now brings in other stakeholders as well, so that once the decisions are taken in unison and implementation, you remember, these implementations are not going to happen collectively at G20 level. This is not an international organization. It is only a grouping.
Right.
Nations will have to go back and implement these things on their own. And unless they are in unison in decision making, they will not go back and implement these things. We have seen that happening in Climate Fund, for example. So that is why coming of Africa is very significant.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Let's listen in once again to the opening remarks of the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, at the opening session of the Leaders Summit, which began some time back here in capital New Delhi at the Bharat Mandapam. The Prime Minister spoke about a lot of things. If I could request my producer to once again play so that we can hear for ourselves. All right, so we will play that for you in a moment. Our back-end team is getting that there. He spoke about a lot of issues. He started with how human-centric approach is key to India's presidency and, of course, the need of the hour. He spoke about how COVID pandemic bared the trust deficit that exists in the world, and that how the time for mitigating the global trust deficit is there. And let's listen into the Prime Minister.
नमस्कार। औपचारिक कार्रवाई शुरू करने से पहले हम सभी की ओर से कुछ देर पहले मोरक्को में आए भूकंप से प्रभावित लोगों के प्रति मैं अपनी हार्दिक संवेदना प्रकट करना चाहता हूं। हम प्रार्थना करते हैं कि सभी इंजर्ड लोग शीघ्र स्वस्थ हो। इस कठिन समय में पूरा विश्व समुदाय मोरक्को के साथ है और हम उन्हें हर संभव सहायता पहुंचाने के लिए तैयार हैं। Your Highnesses, Excellencies, G20 के प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर भारत आप सभी का हार्दिक स्वागत करता है। इस समय जिस स्थान पर हम एकत्रित हैं, यहां से कुछ ही किलोमीटर के फासले पर लगभग 2500 साल पुराना एक स्तंभ लगा हुआ है। इस स्तंभ पर प्राकृत भाषा में लिखा है, हेवम लोकसा हित मुखेति अथ इयम नातिसु हेवम, अर्थात मानवता का कल्याण और सुख सदैव सुनिश्चित किया जाए। 2500 साल पहले भारत की भूमि ने यह संदेश पूरे विश्व को दिया था। आइए इस संदेश को याद कर इस G20 समिट का हम आरंभ करें। 21वीं सदी का यह समय पूरी दुनिया को नई दिशा दिखाने वाला और नई दिशा देने वाला एक महत्वपूर्ण समय है। ये वो समय है जब बरसों पुरानी चुनौतियां हमसे नए समाधान मांग रही हैं और इसलिए हमें ह्यूमन सेंट्रिक अप्रोच के साथ अपने हर दायित्व को निभाते हुए ही आगे बढ़ना है। फ्रेंड्स, कोविड-19 के बाद विश्व में एक बहुत बड़ा संकट विश्वास के अभाव का आया है। युद्ध ने इस ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट को और गहरा किया है। जब हम कोविड को हरा सकते हैं तो हम आपसी विश्वास पर आए इस संकट पर भी विजय प्राप्त कर सकते हैं। आज G20 के प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर भारत पूरी दुनिया का आह्वान करता है कि हम मिलकर सबसे पहले इस ग्लोबल ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट को एक विश्वास, एक भरोसे में बदलें। यह हम सभी के साथ मिलकर चलने का समय है और इसलिए सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास का मंत्र हम सभी के लिए एक पथ प्रदर्शक बन सकता है। वैश्विक अर्थव्यवस्था में उथल-पुथल हो, नॉर्थ और साउथ का डिवाइड हो, ईस्ट और वेस्ट की दूरी हो, फूड, फ्यूल और फर्टिलाइजर का मैनेजमेंट हो, टेररिज्म और साइबर सिक्योरिटी हो, हेल्थ, एनर्जी और वाटर सिक्योरिटी हो, वर्तमान के साथ ही आने वाली पीढ़ियों के लिए हमें इन चुनौतियों के ठोस समाधान की तरफ बढ़ना ही होगा। फ्रेंड्स, भारत की G20 प्रेसिडेंसी देश के भीतर और देश के बाहर इंक्लूजन का, सबका साथ का प्रतीक बन गई है। भारत में ये पीपल्स G20 बन गया। करोड़ों भारतीय इससे जुड़े। देश के 60 से ज्यादा शहरों में 200 से ज्यादा अधिक बैठकें हुई। सबका साथ की भावना से ही भारत ने प्रस्ताव रखा था कि अफ्रीकन यूनियन को G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता दी जाए। मेरा विश्वास है कि इस प्रस्ताव पर हम सबकी सहमति है। आप सबकी सहमति से आगे की कार्रवाई शुरू करने से पहले मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को G20 के स्थायी सदस्य के रूप में अपना स्थान ग्रहण करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं।
We were replaying the remarks, the opening remarks of Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the opening session of the Leaders Summit, which is currently on at the Bharat Mandapam, a stone's throw away from our studios where we are here in capital New Delhi. We played that a little while back. The session is a closed door session where leaders of the G20 countries now plus the African Union being represented by Comoros and of course the nine invited countries and the permanent invitees of international organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, UN, etc. The leaders of these organizations, countries are participating in the opening session called One Earth and deliberating on what the Delhi Declaration should include, preclude, leave out, and or if there is on which there is consensus, and work on the final negotiations for the Delhi Declaration.
Yes.
I have with me Atul Anecha of India Narrative in the studio, and also Professor Swaran Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University over a video link with us. Okay, Professor Swaran Singh, to you first. Now, the Prime Minister spoke about, used the word, he said, when he was saying, he said COVID pandemic saw a dip in the global, or bared the global trust deficit. And he used the word war has aggravated that. कि युद्ध ने उसको has aggravated that in the language that he used, because his address was in Hindi. He used the word yuddh. Does that signal a change in India's stance on how it sees what was referred to till now as the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
I think this is important to underline, that India has stood neutral on Ukraine crisis. But India's neutrality has been dynamic, and we have noticed the change over a period of time. It's constantly evolving, sharpening, firming up in terms of what India wants to say as the crisis continues over a longer period of time. So it's not a cut and dry standard position that India has held. To very quickly mention, India began by simply saying we are concerned, and then saying we regret, then saying we deplore. And first time in August last year, India said the Bucha massacre should be investigated independently by an international agency, which was a sharp change in the position. And then, of course, when in September, Prime Minister met President Putin in Samarkand, that sentence that became a sentence which was used by so many other leaders and was part of Bali summit, which is where he said this era is not an era of war.
Yeah.
So war word had already come in from September last year. And in May this year in Hiroshima, again, he went a step further to say that sanctity of territorial integrity of nations must be respected by all nations. So India's neutrality over a period of time has really evolved and become far more precise as to what India wants to say about continuing, the problems in Ukraine. And of course, at the same time, while India is contacting, the big leaders on both sides, India has also provided 100 tons plus of humanitarian assistance to people in Ukraine. So at the two levels, where without asking questions, without debating on the merit points, India is willing to provide humanitarian aid to people who are suffering destruction and death and so on. And at the same time, keep making efforts in connecting two sides if possible. In fact, that is a big miss that absence of President Putin and Xi Jinping is making for India. India could have made a breakthrough. You saw Lavrov meeting Antony Blinken in the foreign ministers G20 gathering. They even had a small bilateral. If India could have had opportunity to set up a bilateral or even smiling body language of President Joe Biden and President Putin here in New Delhi, that would have been a seminal contribution to mitigation of Ukraine crisis in that sense. What we now hear is UN Secretary General is saying that this is not a war that he sees ending very soon, as both sides are continuing to sort of ratchet up the kind of claims that they have or what they want to do with each other. So in that sense, I think underlining the fact that India now sees it clearly as war, and war, without actually saying so, you understand war has an aggressor and a victim. The whole understanding as an academic of what is called institution of war involves an aggressor. Now, we may keep debating who's the aggressor, but when you call it a war, it means there is a possibility of understanding that there is an aggression and there is a victim. And in that sense, India is defining far more sharply as to what it wants to say. But of course, the focus was on trust deficit. And again, India is pushing on humanitarian, human-centric approach to understanding global issues. And that is why he begins by again citing this whole Prakrit saying, Lokata hit mukhati, is to say India, even in ancient times, had a global vision.
Yeah.
And that is human-centric. Even Constitution, Article 51 talks of India's governments successfully working for peace of human race, not nations. He talks of human race. So at different stages, India has focused on global vision, connecting with global issues from human-centric cultural approach. And that is what India is trying to sort of bring to the table to make sure we are not still divided into politics. We are connected as humans.
Okay. Professor, we'll come back to you. Atul, I want your comments on, what the Prime Minister said. He spoke about, the need for a trust deficit, but, when he said that that has, the gap has widened further. And in the context of what the UN SG says, the Secretary General says, he doesn't see the war ending anytime soon. So given the deep divisions that exist, and are being reflected by President Putin not coming to the summit, what sort of effect will it have on the text of the Delhi Declaration?
Amritpal, this...
Okay, Atul, can I one sec stop you? My producer tells me in the ear that we will... okay, we will go. We'll go to Bharat Mandapam. Yes, Atul. Yeah.
Yeah. So operative word, Amritpal, is trust deficit, and the need to reduce this trust deficit. Now that is a very, very important template, because from the Indian perspective, we do not want another Cold War to start, where Russia would be on one side, the United States on the other side. So that doesn't go with the spirit at which we are approaching G20. We want the world to come together, and that is the thrust of it. I do not completely agree with what Swaran says.
Right. Mr. Neja, we'll come back to you in a bit. We'll take this forward. Let's take a live update now from Bharat Mandapam, the venue of the G20 Leaders Summit, where all the action is happening, where the opening statement was also made by the Prime Minister of India and also Bharat, and our colleagues Shubhendu Ghosh and Sakal
Bhatt are standing by there to take this show further. So Sakal and Shubhendu, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Amrit and Munmun. Welcome back once again to the venue of the G20, our special presentation where we're getting you all the action. What a big start the G20 engagement has been off to. Right in the beginning, Prime Minister's address of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he talks about the permanent membership of the African Union That's the big news coming in from here at G20. Prime Minister talks about trust deficit and how to deal with it in the global economic and world order. We'll talk about all of that. I'm Shubhendu with my colleague Sakal.
And the biggest story or the big headline as of now that comes from India's New Delhi, the presidency, India's G20 presidency is now African Union, the inclusion of African Union in G20 scheme of things. Definitely India's big G20 moment plus a big diplomatic win. So from next year onwards it's going to be G21, and for that the world is going to remember India's G20 presidency. Let me quickly, in fact, Shubhendu, once again introduce our special guests in the studio, rather our colleagues. Ollie Barrett, thank you very much for joining. Ollie Barrett, senior journalist, DD India, and also Sriram Cholia, author, scholar, expert in international affairs. Ollie, I'll give it to you first. So this again is historical.
Yeah, that's a big moment. The G20 becoming G21. As Ali Assoumani welcomed up to the top table, we saw that.
Did you see that
we saw that hug. We saw that embrace. So
yeah.
I think that's an acceptance of that invitation. That's going to be one of the pictures of the day, certainly. And as you were saying, it also means that within half an hour or so of the G20 summit getting underway here in New Delhi, we have something for India to point to as an achievement. It was much trailed, this idea of the AU joining the G20, but it took some diplomacy to get it over the line, and it looks like we are there. So yeah, we have that first big moment of the G20 already.
Sriram.
Well, 1.4 billion people of Africa deserve this place at the table, and they've been given the table thanks to Indian leadership, Indian persuasion, Indian diplomacy. We have been able to, cut through the ice. They were saying that there are some other groupings that will also object to this and will also, if African Union, why not us, that kind of thing. But, we've been able to overcome all those and get consensus. This is the beginning of the historic presidency of the summit, because one after the other, we're going to see more and more deliverables. This is one big concrete deliverable right at the outset. We came prepared, we got the consensus, and we started with a bang.
Right, and as we get closer to the final outcome of the G20, this is the Leader Summit, 2 days of Leader Summit. Ollie, the G20, India's presidency started with the focus on the Global South. There was a Global South conference. There were deliberations on the manner in which the perspective, the priorities, the aspirations of Global South are going to be given center stage. This inclusion of African Union successfully, an announcement right at the beginning, is a big takeaway of what India has achieved for the Global South in this edition.
I think that's right, and I think it also shows India in the light that it wants to be shown at this summit, which is showing leadership for developing nations, the Global South as well, as you mentioned. We also heard from the Prime Minister at the top of his speech a tribute to Morocco and the earthquake that's taken place there. He did start there, and of course Morocco is a member of the African Union, and we've heard several other leaders talking about that already since they've been here, and I think that just shows one of the ways in which the AU can be welcomed into this grouping is by some of those leaders paying tributes to what's happened in Morocco with that earthquake.
What does this really mean for the 50+ countries of the African Union, and how does it also change the broader narrative of the G20 nations? Now that you had European Union, your European Commission, and now you have African Union. And do you think this consensus building could have been a tightrope for India or a challenge?
Sakal, 55 countries. African Union is a comprehensive regional organization, includes all the member states of the African continent. Apart from them, South Africa is already a individual as a country, a member of the G20. Nigeria, another big African country, has been an invitee country. But for the whole union to get here, I think it symbolizes also that it's their rise,
their representation.
And the average age in Africa is 19 years. They've got the potential for tremendous growth. It's already a major economic partner with most trading powers around the world, including India. We are doing almost 100 billion trade with the African continent, and that's no less than the European Union for us, So in that sense, this is huge. And I think they will be forever grateful to India, because we are the ones who pushed and got this through, They've been wanting to be here, and they deserve to have the place. So I think for people of Africa, it's a day to celebrate, because finally the so-called marginalized or downtrodden of the planet are getting a seat at the high table.
Prime Minister, when he used the gavel and called to attention, and then when the Foreign Minister went and brought the African Union chair and made him sit in the front row, along with those visuals, people of Africa are going to remember.
There's a larger message there.
Because, see, for centuries of colonial exploitation, racism, slavery, they've come out of all that. There are still challenges in the African continent. We're supporting them, but giving them the dignity and the place.
Yes, the common civilizational link, history that India and Africa shared. We were covering the BRICS summit, where we were also talking about how Mahatma Gandhi and his legacy also connects India with South Africa. Celebration of that civilizational link in that hug that Prime Minister gives to the representative of the African Union, that becomes symbolically very, very significant, isn't it?
Yeah, our development partnership on the African continent is very strong. We do a lot of human resource capacity building, to a lesser extent physical infrastructure. Our telemedicine, tele-education, these are huge successes, the Pan-African e-network, and we are building major strategic partnerships, especially with countries which are along the Indian Ocean coast, on the eastern coast of Africa. Right. So I think they are all, going to look to this as a moment where they were allowed, their voice finally came through, because, they were like the voiceless. And so when we say voice of the global south, we have now delivered on it in such a concrete way. And in fact, they don't need an intermediary anymore now. Right. Because once they are full members, they speak for themselves. And that is Indian foreign policy, is always to empower our partners so they speak for themselves and represent themselves. They don't need anybody else to be seconding for them.
Only collectively, what does it mean for the global south when Africa, with 1.3, 1.4 billion people finding a voice on the global high table, more developing emerging economies finding a voice of their own? What does it mean for the collective of the global south?
Well, certainly from an economic perspective, it just brings more countries into the fold via that membership of the AU, now effectively getting a representative voice at the table here at the G20, the G21. That's right, and in economic terms, it adds hugely more economic heft to this grouping, a grouping that was born out of really finance and economic cooperation and all of that. There's just more economies at the table now having their representation through the African Union. So I think that's an important part of it as well. And the AU, as you say, it wanted to be here, it wanted a voice, and it also represents the further move away in some of these groupings from Western dominance. The African Union now with that seat at the table, as we were saying earlier, with India wanting to represent the global south in that way.
The economic aspect, since we are talking about it, now we do know that we also have the representatives from the African Union Development Agency, and we do know that one of the larger agendas also includes increase in loans from the multilateral agencies for lower economy groups and developing nations. And I think that really makes more sense now because this is also one of the major agendas in this 18th G20 summit. Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it makes sense now.
Yeah, debt, the issue of debt is, we have brought it to the center stage. Since the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war, the kind of insolvency and financial collapses we are seeing, especially in least developed countries, is just like 9 pins falling one after the other. And to arrest that, we need some kind of an agreement at G20 level on debt. And the Africans in particular have been very, very insistent that there must be restructuring in a fair and equitable manner. So now that they have a seat, they can actually vote on these issues.
In fact, restructuring of the entire debt architecture is something that also has been extensively discussed in as a run-up to the G20 summit this time around.
Sakal, the discussion format, the decision-making structure of G20 is based on consensus, right? Negative consensus. Even if one member says no, you can't get a declaration, you can't get an outcome. African Union now actually has a say to on these points which matter most to those 1.4 billion people they represent, and for them to say no on debt, for example, on climate, on trade, on all these fundamental developmental issues, this gives them the chance to really fight for their rights. Earlier they were like outside the room.
No representation.
Right. Only if you can see it in sequence of the big events that have happened in the past 2 weeks. Again, I'm going to refer to the BRICS, which this year became from 5 to 11 nations, 6 new nations, developing emerging economies getting a voice. Now in G20, African Union comes in, 55 countries of the emerging world find a voice. When Prime Minister speaks about the issue of trust deficit in the global order, is he also showing the way how to fix it? You give representation, you give voice to the people who have been for so long not represented by themselves.
And it's interesting because events like this are often criticized for being a talking shop, that you don't get anything done. But when you actually talk to individual delegations who attend events like this, they'll say, actually, we do get quite a lot done. And it's not just about the final declaration and things we can all agree around the table. It's about some of those bilateral meetings off to the side. Just to take one example, the UK and Singapore have announced a deal overnight, a new strategic partnership. It's just one example of how there are lots of meetings that will take place at this summit, which now include the African Union as an incoming member of the G20. So it's an illustration, really, I think, in the way that you can bring other voices, other groupings into these wider organizations. And in buildings like this and that one over the road, leaders and delegations certainly feel they can get things done.
Right, and Professor Cholia, when the BRICS reform happened, it was said that it's sending out a message to the world out there that multilateral reforms are need of the hour and we can do it. Now this reform at G20, that voice, that push is getting louder, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the time for the South to rise, and we have been, the sense of solidarity has always been there. You know, there was something called the G77. It's still there in the UN General Assembly. More than 120 countries are part of it now. And India has always been an integral part of G77. But there was always this perception that somehow, you know, they talk about justice, they talk about equity, they talk about fairness and to make a better and a more democratic world order, but the hypocrisy remains in terms of the real players and the ones who are controlling the show. So there's a lot of resentment in Africa against big powers, you know, and they think that they have always been trampled upon and exploited and neglected. So now what India has done is turned it around, because think about it diplomatically. If India as the host is proposing AU membership, can any one of the G20 members dare, with a conscience, say no to it? If they say no to it, they lose access to the African market. They're going to really struggle there, you know, and they'll be painted as villains, and they cannot afford it because Africa is rising. They need the access to the minerals and, you know, to the raw materials and to the rising middle class in Africa, which is 400-500 million people. So I think what we are seeing is we have played our hands very smartly. We told them, all the G20 members, you know, vote with a conscience on this matter, because if you say no and try to block this, the wrath of Africa is going to be on you, you know? Yes. So these things matter in diplomacy, and I think they all heard it. They all are very wary of being seen as somehow blocking Africa. If you're blocking Africa, you're blocking 1/4 of humanity, you know? Future. I think India put across that kind of viewpoint and turned it around, you know?
Turn it around, and can we also then, in that sense, definitely is being looked at as a big diplomatic win under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
This is one of the many.
Yes, and the whole aspect of human-centric approach that India has been hammering under its presidency, one of the cornerstones. The whole aspect of calling it People's Summit, by the way, Prime Minister in his speech also did mention, that is also something which we've not seen in earlier summits.
And also, Sakal, I saw Prime Minister mentioning a Sanskrit saying about the need for unity and to work for the well-being of everybody, you know. And I think that was his opening call to remind all the G20 members that they must behave responsibly. And here, this is not the table to do individual slugfests. Rather, think about the big picture. The whole world is watching us. We are, you know, carrying the aspirations of the whole world on our shoulders. So it was kind of like a statesman-like opening speech that elevated the level of the discourse to another, you know, sphere altogether. And he's saying, here we are. Okay, every country has national interest. Every country comes in with its bargaining positions and points and all that. All that horse trading will happen. But remember one thing, at the back of your mind, it should be one earth, one family, future, and one future.
Yes, yeah. And that point, what was the underlying message when Prime Minister talked about bridging the trust deficit?
See, look, for weeks now, they have been haggling over the declaration. I'm sure many would have been, contesting this point or the other. It will go down to the wire as always. These days, the summits are all like that. 11th hour, finally there is agreement. So what he's basically saying is preparing the leaders to say we all have to make compromises. We all have to make compromises for the sake of a global good, This is not a race where a zero-sum game where I win and you lose. We have to create some kind of a win-win logic for 20 and 21 from now on.
Ollie, you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, just to say that this is clearly a diplomatic win to start the summit, but there's a huge diplomatic challenge to come over the next 24 hours or so. Can they reach a final declaration, or will issues like Ukraine get in the way? So yes, we've started with India being able to register a win, but there's a difficult period of a day or so ahead. Yeah.
The challenge, but would you like to, that's a very interesting point. Ollie,
diplomacy, they always find a workaround with wording. One or two paragraphs, one or two sentences, one country or two or three or a group of countries may say we don't like this. We will have to find a language. The basic language of G20 will be in English, and then it will be translated in other language. So I think English has sufficient breadth to be able to satisfy different needs and different parties, and we will find consensus. There's just no question. Whoever tries to sabotage this is going to be sidelined, and the costs of sabotage are very high. So I think I'm optimistic that India has it worked out.
But do you think this must have actually come up more often, or maybe not at all too much in the entire run-up, whatever deliberations and consultations the G20 members have had till this stage, Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, yeah, the differences are very stark. But think about this. India is has partnerships both with Western countries and with Russia. And I think we are going to be using leveraging all those strategic partnerships to be able to cut across to all sides. And so there's that bilateral chemistry we spoke about that is going to come in. And a lot of the persuasion is on that basis too. The host has certain prerogatives, and we're going to use those.
Yes, so as a host, do you think India has been able to navigate its way? Because if you remember, there was this also parallel narrative that maybe some countries will try to persuade Indian leadership, to persuade Russia that the war should end, whereas India's position on this has been absolutely neutral in the sense that India is taking its own side. We are leaving none behind when it comes to war, but we stand with peace. Sriram?
Yes, and also, Sakal, I think what we are trying to impress upon the G20 members is this is primarily a global economic forum. Let's focus on those issues and deliver on a developmental agenda. Geopolitical rivalries can exist, but those are not within the mandate or the remit of the G20. Let's not even bring those to the table. Ideally, we should not even bring them to the table. But of course, countries being countries, international politics being international politics, it will happen. But still, I think the fact that we are trying to depoliticize a lot of these issues will make a difference, because food, digital public goods, environmental sustainability, energy, fertilizer, agriculture, cyber security, these should be depoliticized. These are not issues where they should be kind of like a boxing match between countries. Yeah. Rather, we should all be holding hands and doing this.
Yes, and only quoting from Prime Minister's address, when he underlines the words which have become so common to use together, food, fertilizer, fuel, it sort of defines the key economic and even socio-political challenges that the world is facing today. When he underlines those, what is the manner in which the G20 deliberations from here on, the next couple of days, also going to focus on these key issues? How have they defined the past few months and years of geopolitics?
Well, Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, has come into this summit pointing to exactly those issues and saying that they are being made worse, some of the problems around them, by the conflict in Ukraine, and particularly the Black Sea grain deals. So you, in a way, can't separate those issues, and that will lead to some awkward conversations, I'm sure, around the table. But at the same time, there has certainly been a series of G20 events leading up to this point, hosted by India, that will have avoided the issue of Ukraine entirely and will have focused on other things. And India has made a big deal out of all of these various different ministerial level meetings up to now, and making sure that they've received huge amounts of attention and focus in a way that we haven't seen in many previous G20 hosting years. And so, in a sense, you can sometimes have conversations that don't don't include some of those difficult topics, but sometimes it's unavoidable.
This development agenda that India has been trying to push, I mean, Prime Minister Modi earlier, we know, in conversation with the Russian president, has spoken about how this is not the era of war.
Yeah.
And then he takes forward the G20 development agenda, mentions those words, fuel, fertilizer, and food. How is he taking that agenda forward in no unclear terms here?
See, I think at the level of the working groups and the ministerials, we have seen that we have tried to steer the discussion away from these controversial geopolitical tussles and to focus on the issue area. G20 is a cluster of several technical issue areas, and on each of them, our researchers and secretariat, the ones who prepare the materials, our experts on each of these domains, have really come so thoroughly prepared with so many backgrounders and proposals and ideas. Actually, the idea is to inundate these member countries, the visitors, as the host, with so much technical stuff that they have to pour over the text and actually work hard day in and out about, does it match my interest, does it not match my interest. So I think we've kept them very busy, and we've been very, very like hard taskmasters as a host in that sense, not leaving any room for sidetracking and to going in other directions. And so, of course, even the ministerials, we could not issue joint communiques at the end of them because of these sticking points. But the point is, if you are coming for something on, digital education, let's say using digital tools to enhance educational access to the poor, what does it have to do with the Ukraine war?
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do is still create that. I know Ollie is right that, they're all interconnected, and the G20 last year also, in the final declaration, they did mention that the, geopolitical conflicts and wars do reduce the chances of G20 delivering on its economic agenda. But then the idea is that there is a UN Security Council. There's, other mechanisms which are able to, there's the Minsk process and all those things in Europe, right? Those are the ones actually meant to resolve the ongoing war and the conflict. G20 can call for, end to hostilities and diplomacy. I'm sure we'll see something about diplomacy. End of the day, no matter what side you are on, everybody says every war ends through diplomacy. The question is about timing. The Western countries and Ukraine are saying we will only do diplomacy after we regain our territory. The Russians are saying we are ready for diplomacy now because they are controlling Ukrainian territory. But I think everybody will be on the same page that diplomacy is needed, right? And I think that is enough of a signal that the G20 wants diplomacy to succeed. We don't want fighting.
You talked about UN Security Council. In fact, just quoting the Secretary General, in fact, he did press one of the bigger takeaways of his address day before yesterday was reform in the UNSC. But I would want to just take our focus once again back to Prime Minister's, address. Very inclusive, precise, but that is something which also Sri Ram set the agenda under India's presidency, where Prime Minister again quoted "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas." And the larger message. He did the specific mention of bridging the trust deficit and moving on, laying the larger vision for the global south.
Yeah, Vishwas, the term trust is something, I think Prime Minister's diplomacy, not even G20, but generally even with bilaterals, he is a great believer in that. Personal chemistry also says with his peers, like presidents and prime ministers of other countries, he says that he does it so that there is a strong, the roots of the relationship are deep into the soil based on Vishwas. And then, we'll have a flowering tree coming out of it. So I think it's very important. He has done that both at bilateral, multilateral. It's his style. And our overall approach under Dr. Jaishankar's leadership has also been that, to build deep bonds of trust so that when it comes to asking for a favor, we will ask for a favor. When it comes to applying pressure, we will apply pressure. When it comes to, coaxing somebody, we're going to use all these things. Because that comes out of trust and Vishwas. If you don't have that, they're not going to care for you. All these countries say, well, what is India? So only when India comes as a credible interlocutor, as a credible host, then only we can build upon this Vishwas or trust. And I think we have done that through a track record. So we are coming in here with a track record, not just a domestic governance, that is there, but also in international diplomacy, we have a track record that's going to help us pass the finishing line.
Ollie, you want to add to that?
Well, one thing just I think to note is that almost every country that's here, every grouping that's here wants to woo India because of its hugely growing economy. And so from a British perspective, for example,
Yes.
Rishi Sunak wants to get a trade deal out of India.
The FTA talk that's
exactly,
going on,
and that's
yeah.
going to be discussed in their bilateral for sure. But it does mean that the UK is going to be well disposed towards, for example, finding a declaration at the end of the summit. They want to help. They want to help India be able to point to a diplomatic success here. So in some ways, the environment is ripe for that declaration to be reached at the end of the weekend, not to say that it's going to be easy.
Right. Professor Chaulia, so many of the key agendas of the G20 have been laid from the perspective, the needs of the global south, which are in need of the right support and platform. Now, with the big news coming in, the inclusion of African Union as one of the members of the G20, how much of influence, negotiating part, I mean, I'll take an example of climate finance, for example. I mean, we've been negotiating with the developed world to pay for what they've done. With the voice of the developing world, global south getting stronger, how do these critical issues get addressed?
Shubhendu, let's do the number game. 20 countries, now 21, so let's say 21 delegations. 7 from the OECD, G7, and then there are 13 and now 14. So look at it as arithmetic, okay? Emerging powers and developing countries are now going to have approximately 14 voices. Middle and small powers. Richer countries and more advanced countries and big powers are going to be having 7. So you see which way the balance is tilting, right? And of course, those 7, the richer countries, like I said before, because in their rhetoric and also to some extent in their policies, for example, the European Union. The European Union, as you know, already has a permanent membership. They always say that we do things for the developing world and we are big champions of the South, right? Now it's like they have to walk the talk. And because face to face, they have to show that their commitments are real and that they're implementing the commitments. So from that point of view, the G20 dynamic is definitely going to shift. Yes. I think the weight is going to be more towards, let's say, the middle layer of developing countries, which are represented by India and all, and then the LDCs who are coming through the African Union seat. Right. I think their voices collectively will be a big pressure group, that the richer countries cannot deny.
Absolutely, Ollie, and we know that the global institutions also who are participating in the G20, there's World Bank, there's United Nations, there are other global institutions, all of them watching this development, clearly seeing how, as it were, the tables are turning, as it were, in favor of the developing world. That will make an impact on the reforms of the multilateral institutions, financial institutions that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think there is some openness from the delegates that are here for that idea of reform of some of those international institutions. India's made that a priority, and I think from the perspective of the Americans and the British, there is a willingness and other European countries to take a look at that and see what can be done about it.
Because the dynamic came out with
exactly
an
right.
statement saying that we need to fund the global south better.
Exactly right, and Joe Biden saying overnight after the talks with Narendra Modi that the case for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council for India, all of these dynamics, I think you have to accept are shifting, and the inclusion of the AU is just an example of that.
All right. So I think we'll have to wrap it up as of now here from our G20 venue DD India studio setup. I'm going to briefly thank Ollie and Sriram for the moment. We'll have to give it back to our DD News studio. It's over to you, Amrit and Munmun from here.
We'll, of course,
Well, thank you, Shubhendu and Sakal, for giving us that from the venue of the summit in capital New Delhi.
Yes, and Mr. Raneja, who is a foreign policy analyst, and I think Professor Swaran Singh might also be with us. That was about what the Prime Minister had said in his address, and that session is going to conclude at 1:30 p.m. India time. The second session begins later in the day at 3 p.m. India time. It ends at 4:45 India time. And that is, of course, on one family. And tomorrow, the focus would be on the Delhi Declaration, and a lot more developments are also expected. Some more bilaterals are expected. But there are going to be 4 confirmed bilateral meetings between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and various G20 member states. Let's quickly touch upon them. Okay, let's quickly touch upon them. Mr. Aneja, the first visit of UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, a very, very young Prime Minister, an Indian origin Prime Minister. The question is, will there be continuity from the Boris Johnson administration to Mr. Sunak's administration? Because there is a focus on Roadmap 2030 that we've seen in the Boris Johnson administration. And what does being an Indian origin British Prime Minister really mean as far as India is concerned for this relationship?
Well, you understand the pulse of India if you're coming from there, so that helps. And you know, we were talking about personal chemistries, etc. I mean, that really gets established if you understand the cultural pulse of the place. So that is something which is a big plus for Indian origin British Prime Minister. But we have to remember he's a British Prime Minister, and I do not see a lack of continuity. They would be tweaking because both are Conservative Party, from Boris Johnson to Rishi Sunak. So that is expected to continue. In fact, I can see a pressure coming on Rishi Sunak of not being too Indian from the local London crowd, which has a mix of Pakistanis and South Asians and others. So not to look too Indian as it is. But he is a British citizen and he has to carry forward British interests. And that we will see. Plus, when it comes to the deliverables, the free trade area agreement, I think that's something which we have made a lot of progress already. And that is something which should come through.
It's been 18 months plus already, and they're trying to negotiate on a lot of finer points. Do you think that there will be breakthroughs?
Look, we are also hard bargainers. Just because he's an Indian origin Prime Minister doesn't mean that we are going to soften up on that. So we are going to do what is in best interest of India. And that's going to take time. Especially this government, you know, they're not going to be freebies anyway. So unless it suits India's interest, but of course, we also look at mutual interest as well and come to areas of convergence. We are not going to give in soon. So that's going to take time. You know, there is this issue about visas for Indians going to the UK. And there have been restrictions on that. So all that has to go away, and you have to be more open to our interests of mobility when it comes to the UK. There are takeaways from UK to India. I mean, London, the world's biggest one of the biggest financial centers, and there are best practices over there which we may like to adopt as we develop our growth and banking sector. So there are convergences, but unless we come to a balance and a win-win, I don't think we're going to get through that. It may take longer than we expect.
All right, let me bring in Professor Swaran Singh here. In the other important bilateral that's scheduled for today, Professor, is the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and with Fumio Kishida of Japan. What could we expect to transpire there?
I think clearly Japan over the last 2 decades has built very special relationship with India. And one common reason for that increasing proximity has been their shared concern about China. So in all these meetings, that of course remains the kind of an issue at the center of their discussions. But of course, they have gone beyond that, and Japan has emerged as a major partner of India in several multilateral and, of course, domestic infrastructure development projects. So some of those issues could also be going forward. There is whole conversation about India, United States, Saudi Arabia signing some kind of a connectivity economic corridor on focusing on rail and port infrastructure. Japan, I'm sure, will be again happily engaged in that kind of exercise. So with case of Fumio Kishida coming to Delhi, talking to Indian Prime Minister has been a regular exercise. They are constantly in touch with each other. So they could be basically, first of all, reinforcing several of the things that they have already decided to move together. And then, of course, exploring new possibilities. And Japan could also play an important role in funding several of the initiatives that could be taken at end of this 2-day summit, because money has to come from somewhere for whether it is climate mitigation or it is other kind of development initiatives. There is whole focus on digital public infrastructure. To take it to the global south would require resources, and I think again Japan could step in that as well and contribute to that kind of partnership. Japan would like to match up and expand its footprint in Africa. And India could be an important partner, starting from the old Asia-Africa growth corridor in that sense. So, between Japan and India, I'm sure there are several areas, but just one quick point on Rishi Sunak's visit and his inaugural first visit here and his being Prime Minister of Britain. I think what is very noticeable is the humility that Rishi Sunak displays, especially during his visits to India, which again reflects the kind of ethos that India has and kind of culture that India has. Yes, he will be bargaining hard as British Prime Minister, and I agree with Atul that he may be, under scrutiny more than any white man as Prime Minister of Britain. But the fact that increasing number of ethnic Indians are now, heading important institutions, you have World Bank President Bagga here now. So that kind of imagination of India, being available, and Indian Prime Minister has constantly tried to project India from the cultural standpoint, and I think that kind of visibility of India with at least two important leaders joining G20, World Bank President and Prime Minister of Britain being of Indian ethnic origin, that is something that is also, I think, that plays up in terms of showcasing India as an ancient civilization and a culture of a very different kind.
Yes.
All right. On that note, let me thank both my guests, Professor Swaran Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in the National Capital, and also Atul Aneja, editor, India Narrative, for being on the show and lending us your insights. Well, that's it from me and Munmun at the moment. We'll be back in some time. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.
Namaskar.